Have you ever wondered if babies can understand when we speak? Or how much do they understand? In 1988, a group of researchers had many of the same questions. They decided to test whether or not infants could distinguish between two different languages, and went on to perform 8 different experiments to determine the extent of infants' abilities. The first experiment examined 4-day-old French infants from monolingual families to see if they could differentiate French from Russian. The infants would be played tape recordings of the same sentences in French and Russian. The researchers found a fluent French-Russian bilingual to produce all of the sound clips. By using the same person for all the clips, the speaker's accent, intonation, and tone of voice would be consistent, eliminating potential confounds.
Now, you may be wondering, how is it possible to tell if 4-day-old infants can distinguish between two languages? The answer is actually quite interesting. When infants listen to the same sound over and over again, they become used to it and tend to relax, or rather, habituate. Habituation means that your brain tunes out stimuli, things that draw your attention, that are deemed insignificant, in efforts to focus energy on things that are more important.
However, when something that you have tuned out changes, your brain will dishabituate and become more aware of the stimuli again. This technique was used to determine if the infants could detect change in language.
To translate these reactions into numbers, the researchers used a fun device, very similar to a pacifier, to measure the infant's sucking rates. Once habituated to one language, the infants would increase their sucking when hearing a new language, indicating that they have registered the change.
The infants were randomly assigned to one of 4 conditions: a French-Russian condition or a Russian-French condition, where they listened to one language followed by the other, or a French or Russian-only condition. In each condition, infants were played their respective tapes until their sucking rates had reduced enough to indicate that they had habituated. Once this occurred, they listened to the new tapes respectively.
The results of this first experiment indicate that French infants were able to distinguish between French and Russian and in fact showed a preference for French. Now, you would think that they'd be done here. They wanted to test if French was somehow more interesting than Russian. So, they ran the experiment again, only with infants from non-French speaking households. These results showed that the infants could not differentiate between the two languages, indicating that French is not more interesting than Russian, and that some form of familiarity with one language may be necessary.
To further test the generalizability of these findings, a third experiment was run to see if the monolingual French infants could distinguish between English and Italian. The new recordings came from a fluent English-Italian bilingual, once again producing the tapes for both languages. Infants were assigned to one of 4 groups, only this time consisting of English and Italian. After collecting the data, the researchers found that, once again, the infants could not distinguish between the two languages. To make sure that English and Italian weren't fundamentally more difficult to distinguish, the 4th experiment involved 2-month-old American infants. Because these babies were older, the sucking procedure would likely not be as effective, so the team decided to use a looking while listening procedure.
The infants sat in a chair while looking at an image projected on a screen. Like the previous experiments, the babies heard the first audio recording and then the next audio recording. The duration and frequency of their fixation on the screen was measured. As expected, the infants were more fixated on the screen during English samples than during the Italian samples, suggesting that English isn't fundamentally more difficult to distinguish. The researchers then decided to test if the American infants could distinguish between French and Russian. The procedure was the same. The baby sat in front of a screen, listened to their assigned audio recordings, and their fixation on the screen was recorded. As predicted, the American infants were not able to distinguish between French and Russian. Again, the infants were only able to distinguish a language that they were familiar with.
To understand how the infants differentiate between languages, the team decided to run the same experiment, but playing the recordings backwards. Backwards recordings preserved the speech's acoustic characteristics, but changed the linguistic organization. The French infants could not tell the difference between backwards French and Russian tapes, indicating that language recognition must be based on something other than patterns of acoustic change. The original French and Russian recordings were then played at lower frequencies, similar to how things might sound in the womb. In this case, the infants were able to recognize the difference between the recordings. The same was done with the American babies, with low-frequency English and Italian. Once again, the infants focused more on the screen during English samples, suggesting that infants use prosodic cues like intonation, tempo, and speech pauses to distinguish their native language.
So, let's do a recap. French infants can distinguish French from Russian, and American infants can distinguish English from Italian. However, these infants cannot distinguish between two foreign languages. This is not because any language is more difficult to distinguish from another, but rather because the infants are familiar with their native language. Exposure to speech allows infants to become familiar with the prosodic cues and acoustic characteristics of their native language, making it easier to recognize.
So what can we take away from this? People are born with the ability to recognize their native language and can distinguish it from other languages very early on. Infants are smarter than you think.